What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to be talking about X-Men. So it's finally time to start talking about the X-Men movies here on the channel. There are so many comic book movies of old that I've yet to cover here on the channel, and the only X-Men films that I've actually covered here on the channel so far have been the latest one, X-Men Dark Phoenix, which I was not a huge fan of, to be completely honest, and the Christmas PG-13 version of Deadpool 2 called Once Upon a Deadpool. So my plan moving forward is to have a different guest on for every X-Men video as we go through every single X-Men movie that has come out, including the 2 Deadpool films that I will properly review. Today I'm very happy to be joined by Bryan from RWR Movie Reviews, and you guys can find the link to his channel down below in the description box. Go give him some love, let him know I sent you. We'll be hearing from him in just a little bit as he lets us know what he thought about this movie after his very first watch, which was crazy for me to find out. At this point, I kind of assume that people have seen all of these movies, but you know, it's always interesting to hear how people have different experiences. Ultimately, I've been slowly making my way through the MCU films and other older comic book films that have come out from the times before I had a YouTube channel. And here we are now talking about 2000s X-Men. Before we get too far into this review, I feel like I have to kind of touch on my history with the X-Men in particular. Growing up, like many others, I was addicted to the 90s animated show and would grow up to love more of the animated shows that would come out when I was a kid. Things like Wolverine and the X-Men or the X-Men Evolution show, and I was also a huge fan of just various appearances from these characters in other shows. When it came to my love for comic book characters as a kid, it was usually, as far as like top 3, it was probably like X-Men, Spider-Man, or maybe Spider-Man, X-Men, not sure where they kind of rank, but it was like Spider-Man, X-Men, and maybe like Batman in the mix. Those were my absolute favorites, with just my absolute love for Marvel and DC being shooting through the roof since I was a little boy. And so, yeah, without a doubt, X-Men was a huge part of my life, whether it was the cartoons, the video games, the toys, the movies, the comic books. I was always just a huge fan of this world, these characters, and the various challenges they had to deal with, as well as all the various characters. I feel like the X-Men, without a doubt, have some of the most iconic comic book characters of all time, both on the hero side and on the villain side. And I think that anytime they've been able to do something successfully with the X-Men, they really are able to kind of highlight that and use all these really badass characters to tell a really great story. So when this movie came out, I was 7 years old. This movie came out the year after The Phantom Menace and just a couple years before something like Sam Raimi's original Spider-Man film. And it's kind of crazy to look back now because movies like this, that first Sam Raimi Spider-Man film, Blade, were part of that earlier echelon of comic book movies, specifically Marvel comic book movies, that would kind of lend to where we are today, or kind of lead us to where we are today. And so that's kind of one of the coolest parts about going back to revisit a film like this, is being able to see the stepping stones that would lead us to where we are today, to lead us to something like an Avengers Infinity War or Endgame. It's crazy because before this, before Blade, and before just this little, snippet of time, we had some of the Batman films and, the Christopher Reeve Superman movies. But we also had terrible like Captain America movie and a terrible like Dolph Lundgren Punisher film. And overall, comic book movies were not what they are today. They were not as digested by audiences. And this movie was one of the first films to ever take really goofy source material or something that, is a little bit more bright and colorful and bring it down to a pretty grounded level with this movie. And I have to commend the director of this film, Bryan Singer, for the way that he chose to approach the source material, both in this film, the second film, and a film that's part of the prequel set of movies, Days of Future Past. And I'm looking forward to talking about that one. Now, of course, there's a lot of controversy around Bryan Singer these days, and I'm not really going to touch on that. I'm going to separate the art from the artist. I understand, the guy's definitely not a fantastic person, without a doubt, but yeah, I think he directed a really good film here. And without a doubt, as a kid, this was one of the most formative films in my like falling in love with movies years. The years of me really falling in love with movies. This is without a doubt one of those early stepping stones in all of that for me. I think Bryan Singer directed a really solid film here. I think he did a great job of taking source material that was a little bit over the top, that is goofy and silly, even though it's beloved, and did a good job grounding it for the most part, though I do do have some criticisms. This movie also has a phenomenal cast with some of the best comic book casting ever, honestly, in this movie alone. There's a couple people that maybe could have been cast a little bit better, and some popular characters that X-Men fans will pick out that are just kind of cast by no-name actors and then recasted in later films, which is an issue I have with this series overall. But you have people like Patrick Stewart in here, Hugh Jackman, Halle Berry, Ian McKellen, James Marsden, Famke Janssen, I mean, so many others. And I think the cast is really strong in this film. I think they do a really good job of embodying the roles that they've been given, especially when it comes to the main set of cast members. So the basic premise of this movie, for anybody who's not familiar with the X-Men, is that you have a world filled with mutants, individuals who are born with various abilities, deformities, whatever the case may be, something that makes them very special or different. Because of this, they've kind of had to hide from the world, they kind of have to run away from persecution, and there's a lot of prejudice in this world. The opening scene of this film is one of my favorite opening scenes or scenes in a comic book movie, as we see Eric Lehnsherr, Magneto, in the Holocaust, as we see him dealing with all of that, being separated by his parents and having to go through all of that. Anybody who's familiar with Magneto's story, you know that he went through the Holocaust himself and is a Holocaust survivor, and so that's part of his narrative. And I really love how grounded they get with the opening scene, letting you know that this is going to really pull on some real life prejudices and the various things that have happened to individuals in the world. So without a doubt, this movie and the idea of mutants in and of itself is a metaphor for, different kinds of prejudices and the various kinds of things that we've dealt with in the past. It's definitely symbolic to a lot of the disgusting racism and different things like that that we've consistently see in the world today, and we've seen on really big scales in the past. And as we get further into this more grounded take on the X-Men, we're introduced to Wolverine, played by Hugh Jackman, as well as Rogue, played by Anna Paquin, two loner mutants that end up coming together, one with adamantium claws and the ability to heal himself, and Anna Paquin's character Rogue, who has the ability to touch somebody and either take their powers and kill them if they're a mutant, or if they're not a mutant, just pretty much kill them. She discovers this as she kisses her boyfriend earlier in the film and ends up putting him into a coma. Yeah, that definitely is a power that sucks. And one thing I want to say right out of the gate is I've never been a huge fan of what they did with the character of Rogue. I think that Anna Paquin is a good actress, and I think for the most part she gives a good performance here that you can tell she was directed to give. But for anybody who's familiar with Rogue in the comic books or any of the animated shows, you know that she's a really strong Southern girl, and she's got the strong Southern accent, and she's just a badass. And ultimately, I feel like they kind of made her a wimp in all these movies, and this movie definitely shows that. So you have these two loner mutants that end up coming together and end up finding their way into the X-Mansion with the X-Men and find themselves amidst a battle between the Brotherhood and the X-Men. Amidst all that, on the outside, you have a senator by the name of Senator Kelly, who is pushing for a law where all mutants will have to come out and kind of register who they are and what their abilities are, which of course puts a lot of, really good people who just so happen to be mutants at danger. Then you have the bad guys, which is Magneto, Toad, Mystique, and Sabretooth, as they are kind of, trying to develop a plan here. And Magneto's plan is to take from his own mutant genes and end up spreading it out to various other individuals via this machine and causing them to become mutants. What he doesn't realize is that this does not happen naturally and ends up actually killing the individual Senator Kelly, who is the first test subject of this plan, and does not turn him into the mutant that he actually expected him to be turned into. So ultimately, this is a dangerous thing that Magneto is doing, and the X-Men have to stop him. So that's the basic premise of the film overall, and I think for the most part, they keep it pretty straightforward. It was really nice to go back and revisit this movie and see how straightforward and simplistic it is. It's one of those movies that even though I know it really well, almost like our song, very well, it was smaller scale than I remember, and it doesn't have the biggest of stakes, but at the same time, it also feels big and it feels purposeful, and it also feels really well contained. It doesn't feel as big or over the top or world ending as a lot of comic book movies these days, but it still has stakes, and I think that this movie was able to capture that pretty well, and it's nice to go back to a time when comic book movies were a little bit more contained. Definitely have to praise the composer of this film, Michael Kamen, who did pass away a few years after the release of this film, but I think the score for this film and what he set up musically for this film that would be reprised in future X-Men films, without a doubt, was really great, and I always love hearing the theme that's played around this movie. Beyond that, the special effects are really awesome as well. I think that they still really hold up. There's a couple of moments where some of the CG isn't 100%. There are moments of dialogue that are not 100%. But overall, I do think this film still really holds up visually. The performances are great. The narrative is really strong. And it keeps it straightforward and easy for people to hop into this universe and know nothing about these characters and understand what's happening. So I've talked a lot more than I intended to on this early part of this review. When I come back in just a little bit, we're going to talk about all the various actors and their specific roles, my thoughts on them, who I liked, who I didn't like. But for now, let's go ahead and hear what Ryan from RWR Movie Reviews had to say about this.
Hello everybody and welcome to Reviews with Bryan, and today I'm doing a collaboration with Anthony Perez. I want to thank him for having me on for this collaboration for 2000's film X-Men. So I have never seen this film and I was really interested to dive into this franchise. I've seen a couple of the X-Men films in the past, but honestly I don't really remember them too well, and this kind of kicking off with the X-Men franchise, I was really interested to see what this would bring to the table. This film is directed by Bryan Singer. He's done a few of the other X-Men films. He's done Jack the Giant Slayer and he's done Bohemian Rhapsody. So now without further ado, let's dive into my thoughts on this X-Men franchise. In a world where mutants exist and are discriminated against, two groups form for an inevitable clash: the supremacist Brotherhood and the pacifist X-Men. The film stars Patrick Stewart, Hugh Jackman, Ian McKellen, Famke Janssen, James Marsden, and Halle Berry. So X-Men 2000 was quite a surprise to me. I think that this is one of the easiest superhero movies to follow, especially if you don't even follow the X-Men. I think they do a really good job of having this brief story with Logan and Rogue and explaining it in a way that there's not a ridiculous amount of details and they don't waste runtime, and they do a really good job while they're explaining this short kind of story with blending the action. I think there is a lot of action in this film. I think they do a really good job of not having a lot of downtime while also providing you enough information to get through the film and have you understand what's going on and not actually be confused. And you can also say that the acting is pretty good in this. I didn't really think that anybody was not playing their part to the extent that they should be playing it. Really, the basis of this story is you have Magneto, who doesn't like the fact that the senator is trying to make these mutants self-identify themselves, and he really is really jealous by that because he doesn't want him to pass this law, and that is the basis plot point through this story. And going into this, I really just didn't know exactly how the villain would be. I thought that the villain Magneto, I don't necessarily think he is the strongest villain, but I think that for what he established himself in this film, I think he does enough to where it's believable. Now, his sidekick, Sabretooth, he's just kind of there. I don't really think that he is the strongest character in this. I don't really think that they developed that character enough. He's just kind of there to kind of help him out and go through the ride. And then as far as Storm in this, I think that Halle Berry, I think that she probably has the weakest character out of everybody. She's there and obviously helping out and helping to try to save the day. But I think that her character is definitely the weakest and didn't really do a whole lot for me in this film. And to add on to the last bit about the characters, I did enjoy Cyclops in this. I did watch the cartoon X-Men back in the day a little bit, and Cyclops was one I always really liked. I liked that he could shoot lasers out of his eyes. And James Marsden plays this character really well on this, and I thought that he did a pretty good job. So I enjoyed seeing him on screen. And then I also enjoyed seeing Mystique in this. I really liked that she can change forms whenever she feels like it, and she played a really convincing role in this. But I thought that she did a pretty good job as well. Now, one negative that I can come up with this film, besides the fact that a few characters are underdeveloped, I really don't like some of the lighting in this film. There are shots where it's very dark, and I've had to adjust the settings on my TV several times during these dark scenes, and it's just extremely hard at times to see certain things. I don't know if that's just the way it was shot back in 2000, but it was just really dark in certain points. I do like the darker, dreary scenes, but there are certain parts where it's really black in this film and it's really dark, and it's just a little bit tough to see. So if I had to come up with a negative of this film, that's definitely one negative that I definitely saw throughout the film. And to wrap up my thoughts, I think this is a pretty solid X-Men debut film. Now, some of the characters, like I said, they're underdeveloped, and Magneto, he's not the strongest villain at times, but I think for this kind of film, I think they did a really good job of just having the runtime as what it is and not having filler and having it to where you don't really have to think a ton and it's easily explained and you don't feel like you're lost at any point. I think the film really hits those points. I'm gonna give a score of this film a 3.5 out of 5. I think it's a pretty solid film and I definitely would give it another watch. I think that for me, it's not necessarily one of the best superhero movies ever, but I think it is a pretty solid film and a pretty solid debut for the X-Men. And I definitely am interested in seeing the other films and seeing what they bring to the table and just seeing the journey of these X-Men characters. Thank you guys for watching, and now back to Anthony.
A big thanks to Ryan for being here in this video. Loved hearing your thoughts, and again, it's just crazy to think that this was their very first time watching the movie. But I'm glad I could be the one to kind of get you to check this movie out, and I hope you actually go on and continue to watch the rest of the movies, because I think you'd enjoy them quite a bit, because X-Men 2, the next one, is definitely a step up in the writing. If you already enjoyed this one, I think you'll enjoy that one a lot more. But yeah, a big thanks to you for joining me here in this video. I loved hearing your thoughts, and I look forward to doing more collabs as time goes on. And to all of you guys watching, please go to the link down below in the description box. Go give Ryan some love. Let him know I sent you. And for now, let's wrap up my final thoughts on X-Men 2000. So like I said, I just want to go through the cast members and the various roles that they play and kind of talk about what I think about that, and then we'll wrap this up. Patrick Stewart as Professor Xavier, without a doubt, has to be one of the best casting of all of comic book movie history, I think, without a doubt. I mean, literally ripped from the pages, ripped from the comic books. I mean, at the end of the day, Patrick Stewart could not have been a more perfect choice, and it just, you know, it's proven as the years go on, and every time his character would return, he's a fan favorite, and I think without a doubt he is one of the best comic book movie castings that we've ever had. Moving on to another one though, Ian McKellen as Magneto. Phenomenal in this film. I thought he was so good, and anytime again he reappears as the character, it's like completely ripped from the pages. It's completely ripped from the comic books. He completely embodies who Magneto is, which leads us into another one, which is Hugh Jackman, who plays Wolverine. And I mean, what can I even say that hasn't already been said? The dude has gone on to make multiple films where it's solely about Wolverine, and he's just, you know, the face of this series in so many ways. He's appeared in pretty much every X-Men film, and it's with good reason. Then you have Famke Janssen, who plays Jean Grey, who would go on to be the Phoenix, and I think for the most part she plays this role really well. Her role in this film is kind of subdued based on what my memory of this film was. I think that the romance they try to build on the side between her and Logan feels rushed and unearned when I go back and revisit this film, more so than I remembered it. It does get played on a little bit more in the future films, but based on just the stepping stones of that, you know, flirtatious relationship in this film, it is a bit rushed, and I do think she does a good job, but I wish they would have done a little bit more with her. But you know, she is a good part of the movie. Then you have James Marsden as Cyclops, Scott Summers, and I think that he really embodies the character well. Just the look of him is literally, again, ripped from the pages. I think that he has the chiseled jawline, the hair, everything about him just screams Scott Summers. He is 100% the character that I've seen in cartoons and comic books and video games for many years. I think he captures that essence really well, and yeah, without a doubt, some of the best comic book movie casting again. Then here's one that I struggle with, which is Halle Berry as Storm, and as a kid, I really enjoyed her performance. You know, I just liked it because I was able to see Storm in a movie. But ultimately, as I got older and I fell in love with various other versions of Storm, you know, the version of Storm that I think we all love the most is the very motherly, you know, leader of the X-Men, or one of the heads of the X-Men, with a strong African accent, who just has a lot of wisdom and is just a really strong character. And overall, I don't think Halle Berry really captures that in this film. She doesn't have the accent, and they kind of throw that part away. And ultimately, her character in this film is kind of a side character on every level. She shows up and does a couple of things with weather, but ultimately she isn't really an impactful character. She doesn't really have an abundance to do, and I thought she had way more to do in this film until rewatching it, and I thought, you know, she's in the movie, she definitely has her moments, but without a doubt, she's definitely one of the main X-Men characters that is sidelined in this film, though she is given more to do in the later films in the franchise. Then we have Anna Paquin as Rogue, and like I mentioned, I think they just don't capture Rogue all that well. Every other iteration of the character is a really strong Southern girl, somebody who eventually would end up flying around and being a really strong character, and ultimately, you know, when you see her in this, and you see her in the second one, and you see her in the third one, and you see her in, you know, Days of Future Past, they really never did much with her character to really make her the version that you see in the comic books. You know what I mean? Like, I just feel like she's a character they never really did justice to. I'm okay with characters being slightly different than their comic book versions, but ultimately it just doesn't make sense to me to have, you know, her in this movie, have Rogue in the series, and never really do her character the full justice that we've seen her character have in the comic books and cartoons and pretty much anything else that her character has been involved in. And then here's one of my biggest gripes about the movie: Tyler Mane as Sabretooth. Now, Sabretooth is a character that has a lot of beef with Wolverine, and they completely and utterly dropped that. One of my biggest issues with all of these X-Men films is, you know, I like them doing something different with these characters and the story, but when you completely, you know, avoid or ignore, you know, character connections that are part of the storylines, it just feels like a slap in the face to the fans who have kept up with it. Things like Juggernaut being, you know, the stepbrother or the half-brother of Charles Xavier. You know, when he shows up later on, it's just kind of like another random dude. Things like Nightcrawler not being the son of Mystique in the second movie. I just don't understand why they did that. Like any longtime X-Men fan, it was probably just like me, just thinking, why? And then in the case of this, you know, that arch nemesis vibe between Wolverine and Sabretooth is the same as Spider-Man versus Venom or Lex Luthor versus Superman. At the end of the day, Wolverine versus Sabretooth is one of those main, you know, arch nemesis vibes, and I think that the fact that they kind of just throw that away and then they try to do something super different with it with the prequel and X-Men Origins Wolverine with a different actor, it just is messy. Tyler Mane is fine in the film. I think he looks like the character from the comic books. I wish they would have kept this iteration of the character around, but they just don't really do much with him. Then you have Ray Park as Toad, who's also well known for playing Darth Maul just a year prior, and has a little moment with a poll where he kind of gives a reference to him being Darth Maul. And yeah, I thought he was great casting. I thought he embodied the role of Toad and that very slimy, just kind of messy character. I wish they would have done more with him. I think ultimately the fact that they killed him off in this movie with that cheesy line that Storm delivers is, yeah, definitely just a letdown, because I've always enjoyed the character of Toad anytime he's appeared. And I think that's one of my biggest gripes with these movies in general, is that, you know, the X-Men characters for the most part rolled over to the next film, and there were certain characters that came back or some that didn't. But when it comes to the Brotherhood characters, they're constantly cycling out, and outside of Magneto and Mystique, you know, a lot of these other characters are kind of just, you know, fodder for the X-Men to take out, which I've always hated, because one of the best parts about any of the X-Men stories is the ability to have, you know, this consistent lineup of X-Men characters versus this consistent lineup of Brotherhood characters, and that, you know, going back and forth and the connections that are built throughout all that and the arch nemesis vibes that are connected between all of that, ultimately that's part of what makes X-Men what it is. So it is a bummer to see in this movie that they take out big players like Sabretooth and like Toad that ultimately are huge characters that are, you know, under Magneto in the comic books. Then you have Rebecca Romijn, who plays Mystique in this film, and I thought she's great in the role. I really enjoy the way they embody Mystique in these films, though again, like a lot of these other characters, I wish they gave them a little bit more to do. Mystique is definitely a very cool, different take on the character. She's a lot more quiet in these iterations, but I do think that the way that they did the makeup on her character and her involvement in things, and even the CG around her turning into different, you know, people, still really works for the most part outside of a couple moments, and I thought that she gave a really solid, creepy and eerie performance. And then the last person I want to talk about is Bruce Davison, who plays Senator Kelly. I think he does a really great job, I hate to put it this way, of playing a very hateful person, somebody who completely shows us somebody who's, afraid, you know what I mean? Someone who's making decisions out of fear, somebody who's making decisions out of just this need to kind of bury things that he doesn't understand or things that he doesn't want to understand. And it is interesting to see, as he's being turned into a mutant later on in the film, how he reacts when he's talking to somebody like Storm. And, he pretty much tells her, like, you have one less person to be worried about in terms of being afraid. Even though it's a really brief moment and that character does end up dying, and the humans never change their perspective on mutants in this film overall, it is nice to see one human who recognizes that not all mutants are bad, and I think that this guy, Bruce Davison, did a really good job playing the role. So a big thanks to you guys for watching. Please hit that like button, comment your thoughts, subscribe for more videos, and please go down below in the description box and go to the channel of my guest today, Ryan, and go give him some love, let him know I sent you, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.